Israel is not unified in its war on Gaza. There are divisions within the Israeli establishment, and all our great folks out there probably know that. But specifically, what Yoav Gallant has been saying for months is that Israel cannot destroy Hamas.
So welcome everyone. Today we have Scott Lucas, who is a very important mentor actually for Middle East Insights platform, and he has been for me as a rock for a very long time. And to talk about him in a professional capacity, which is not going to do justice to him at all, but I'll try my level best. This was written by a volunteer, Sayed Aqsa, and the entire credit goes to her. So I'm just reading out from what she had written. And she had mentioned that, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sayed Aqsa, who is a student of international politics at Aligarh Muslim University and a volunteer at Middle East Insights platform. Today, we are honored to welcome Scott Lucas, a professor, journalist, and also a professor of U.S. and international politics at Clinton Institute, University College Dublin." You have to figure out where Dublin is. If you have to figure out, I'm very sorry. "A specialist in U.S. and British foreign policy, has written and edited 11 books and more than 70 major articles. You have to start searching all of them. He's very active on Twitter. He wrote the radio documentary Suez and co-directed 2000 film Laban. His research interest also covers in current international affairs, especially North Africa, Middle East, Iran, new media, intelligence services. He is the founder-editor of EA WorldView, one of the leading news and analysis sites on U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, especially the Middle East. EA WorldView is now established as a day-to-day leader in the coverage of conflict, sitting alongside, these are Sayed Aqsa's words, and sometimes ahead of CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. That's massive. Very good. He has been an adjunct professor at Tehran University and a member of executive board of the Center for American Studies and Research at American University in Beirut. And he's currently an adjunct professor. He's a professor at the Clinton University Institute at University College Dublin. He has also been the editor of the Journal of American Studies. A couple of things which are very important. The first thing is that Liz Wheeler, who is an American conservative commentator, said that Trump is president-elect for 2 days, And what has happened? Stock market hits record high, migrant caravan at our border dissolves, Hamas calls for end to war, Bitcoin hits record high, Putin ready to end Ukraine war, Qatar kicks out Hamas leaders, EU will buy US gas, not Russian gas, Putin will sell oil in US dollars, Zelensky phones Trump and Elon Musk, NYC, New York City mayor ends vouchers for illegals, Mexico to stop migrants at US border, China wants to work peacefully with us, big US company to move out of China. I repeat, Trump has been president-elect just for 2 days. Now, talking about all of that is also important because there's another important essential development which has happened, that Trump has announced that he has appointed Stephen C. Witkoff to the special envoy position to Middle East. Steve is a highly respected leader in business and philanthropy who has made every project and community he has been involved with stronger and more prosperous. So let us cut to the chase. Sir, what is your, let's hit on the bullseye. When the election results were out and what media failed to cover at the same time, as you had mentioned, is the firing of Yoav Gallant in Israel. So do you think it is a coincidence or not?
No, it's not a coincidence. But let me tell you the difference for me working as an analyst versus someone who works in public relations. That tweet that you read out about what Trump has done in 2 days is a public relations tweet.
Yes.
We could go through as analysts and completely dissect this. For example, the reason why the U.S. stock market rose so quickly is for two reasons. The first is that tech stocks rose in part because Tesla rose. Now, why did Tesla rise? Well, that's because that's Elon Musk's company.
Yeah.
And Elon Musk, of course, is someone who is now very much a part of Trump's inner circle and who will probably get favors from the government for Tesla, right? Other tech stocks rose because they think, in fact, there's going to be a deregulation of tech. So, and because the top 10 wealthiest people in the United States, the day that Trump got elected, between them, they became $64 billion richer.
Wow.
Yeah, 64 billion with a B dollars richer.
I can't even count that.
You can't even count that high, right? And so what has happened is the stock market reflects certain elites who are going to benefit immediately from Trump, right? The reason why the US dollar went higher is because people expect that US interest rates are going to have to go higher. Why are US interest rates going to have to go higher? Because Trump is going to add 15 trillion, that's with a T, trillion dollars to the American debt, right? So, and the idea that Trump's going to end the Ukraine-Russia war in day one after he becomes president, absolutely not, right? That's not going to happen. If anything, Trump is probably going to help Russia enable. He's going to make sure that the Russian invasion succeeds and that Russia can seize part of Ukraine. So, I say that because, it's very important, I think, on a day-to-day basis to cut through a lot of not just misinformation that's out there, but the spin, what we call the spin. So let's apply that to the case of what happened in Israel on election day. So yeah, as I was mentioning to you, I did 35 hours nonstop. I got up on Tuesday morning, and I work with a lot of TV and radio outlets, and I do a lot of writing. And I knew, okay, it's election day. We have to watch a lot of things that are in the air. And I think I finally got a nap at 4:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, right? And by that time, we know that Trump's going to be president. We know that the Republicans are going to control the Senate and probably the House. In the middle of that, I think probably on Tuesday night, when I was at a function, the U.S. Embassy threw a party in Dublin. I got the tweet on my phone, or the message on my phone, that Yoav Gallant had been fired by Benjamin Netanyahu, right? So let's break this down. All right, what does this mean? Israel is not unified in its war on Gaza. There are divisions within the Israeli establishment, and all our great folks out there probably know that. But specifically, what Yoav Gallant has been saying for months is that Israel cannot destroy Hamas. They're just not going to be able to destroy it. They can kill Hamas's leaders, but Hamas will replace those leaders. Hamas is going to operate underground, as it were. We can't kill them. And he was saying it privately, but some of those private conversations were getting out into the Israeli media. Netanyahu's office would push back. In fact, Netanyahu said Gallant is pushing an anti-Israel narrative. Right? Things got to the point where at the end of September, you might remember that there were demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the streets because they want the hostages back that Hamas is holding. And Netanyahu was under a great deal of pressure. What are you going to do about it? So it was on a Monday in mid to late September when the message comes out, Netanyahu's going to fire. Netanyahu's office says he's going to fire Gallant. And this was in the leading Israeli papers. It did not happen then because a day later was when the pager attacks occurred in Lebanon. And what it meant is that Netanyahu and Gallant both wanted a war on Hezbollah so they could agree. They could live with each other, right? Where are the Americans in all of this? The Biden administration, we know, has not cut aid to Israel. They have not called for an unconditional ceasefire. And a lot of the superficial reading of this is that the Biden administration just backs Netanyahu. It's not exactly true. Biden is furious with Netanyahu at what has happened. The Biden administration is furious with Netanyahu. But they don't feel they can publicly cut the aid to Israel because of domestic considerations, right? So what do? Almost since the start of the war, they've been trying to work with those around Netanyahu to try to contain him. So if you look very carefully, they try to get talks with, it was the other members of the war cabinet. There was a man named Benny Gantz, who was the former head of the Israeli military. They were trying to work with him. He finally left the war cabinet in May of 2024. And they were working with Gallant, right? A few weeks ago, they invited Gallant to come to the US to talk about whether or not Israel was going to carry out strikes on Iran. Netanyahu vetoed that trip. And instead, Netanyahu called Biden. That was a show of his authority, which was to the Americans, you don't talk to Gallant, you talk to me, right? On US election day, when Netanyahu is looking at the prospect that the Biden administration is going to be gone, he's looking at the prospect that Trump is going to come in, and Trump is not going to put any pressure on Netanyahu at all. He's going to give Netanyahu a blank check, right? Netanyahu no longer needs to keep Gallant. What are the Americans going to do about it if he fires him? Big deal, right? They've pretty much decimated Hezbollah. That's going to sort of peter out as a military operation. The focus is going to return to Gaza. There's going to be pressure again on Netanyahu for not getting the hostages back, but he doesn't want Gallant adding to that pressure. So now is the time to dismiss him. That's, for me, that's the way you work as an analyst to navigate what's happening in the US and what's happening in Israel.
Yeah,
yeah.
No, that's actually, there was this one particular saying that is going viral, which is that Trump wanted MAGA, but he made MEGA. Like instead of make America great again, he's making Israel great again. But nevertheless, the next question, sir, is that with Qatar now trying to, from 90s, Qatar was having the headquarters of Hamas after the Hamas officials were asked to leave Jordan. At the same time, then under Obama administration, they got more kind of support and tutelage. So now Qatar is actually frustrated with the kind of stalling of the ceasefire negotiations. And it has asked all the Hamas officials to leave the country, though Qatar has made it very clear that if the negotiations start, it will play a role in it. It will get back. How do you see, what if, like the Sudanese ambassador in Doha said that, okay, Hamas can come to Sudan. So what do you see all of these developments as?
First, let's talk about why Qatar would expel Hamas at this point. Qatar will realize that there is absolutely no hope of renewed ceasefire negotiations with Trump coming into the White House. Let's say something very clearly here. I have no love for Hamas, and Hamas bears responsibility for starting the latest cycle of violence with what they did in October of 2023 with that mass killing. But the number one barrier to a ceasefire for months has not been Hamas. It's been Benjamin Netanyahu. Hamas, the three-phase deal for a ceasefire, so the ceasefire in three phases, effectively turns upon that Hamas returns the hostages, and there are about 100 of them, either dead or alive, that they still hold. Palestinians are freed from Israeli jails, and Israel withdraws its forces from Gaza, right? In stages, they withdraw. Hamas will not agree to a ceasefire where you have an Israeli occupation of Gaza. They don't believe in it. They don't believe Israel should occupy Gaza, but also they probably could not survive as the governing authority in Gaza if they agreed to that. Their own population would turn against them, right? You defended us for months. We've had more than 43,000 people killed, and the Israelis are still going to be here. So Hamas can't agree to that, right? On the other hand, Netanyahu, back in September, early September, his own negotiator, who's the head of Mossad, was talking about implementing the first phase of the ceasefire agreement. And Netanyahu came out and said, we must maintain Israeli forces along the Egypt-Gaza border, what's called the Philadelphia corridor. He also has said we must maintain Israeli forces in the corridor across central Gaza, the Nevatim corridor. At that point, when Netanyahu undermined his own negotiator, the talks effectively stopped. What is there to talk about if Netanyahu's saying, we're going to occupy, right? Now, here we are in November, and Qatar knows that Donald Trump is coming in. They know that Donald Trump, because it's now on record, told Netanyahu, do what you have to do, Bibi. There's absolutely no mileage in running the ceasefire negotiations, right? Meanwhile, remember that Qatar has got an American military base, one of the largest in the world that's out there. And remember that in first Trump term, there was a threat to move that U.S. military base out of Qatar because the Saudis were putting pressure on the Qataris, right? Saudis now face Donald Trump coming in. They know that the Saudis are going to play up to Trump and are going to flatter him. They know that the UAE is going to play up to Trump and flatter him. There's no unified Gulf position anymore. So what do they do to try to flatter the Trump administration and play up to them? We'll expel Hamas, right? I'm watching to see if Hamas possibly could go to Turkey because, of course, Hamas officials are already in Turkey. But that's going to depend on what Erdogan wants to do. And that's another interesting dynamic we can talk about. What's Erdogan's play versus Trump? Does Erdogan have to flatter Trump? Does he think he can manipulate Trump? So that's going to play out. But the immediate thing is going to be that Hamas is going to be isolated, as it were, because what I suspect the Qataris are hoping for, the Saudis are hoping for, and the UAE is that Hamas will just give up some of the hostages as a goodwill gesture. That in order to retain some position, Hamas will allow some of the Israelis to go back.
But I don't understand this power asymmetry. For example, even the Israeli civil society, they are protesting about, getting the hostages back. They're a bit unnerved with Qatar pulling out. But one thing which I don't understand in this entire dynamics is that why does the media not equate the number of Palestinian prisoners who are there in Israeli jails in very, very difficult situations and only talk about hostages? I'm not trying to take away. I'm not trying to take away.
But let me ask you a question on Indian media. Indian media, when was the last time that you saw a picture of one of those Palestinian detainees?
On Indian media, to be honest, if I speak about Palestine, I'm labeled as a Hezbollah agent, as like all of that.
But just watching it. Does Indian media ever show you the faces of any of those Palestinian detainees?
No, and it doesn't care, honestly.
Has Indian media ever shown the faces of the Israelis and the foreign nationals who are held by Hamas?
Those who have, a couple of them who have been saved and who were able to come out, yes.
So the Israeli hostages and the foreign nationals who are held by Hamas are humanized. You see them. You see pictures of them. I see pictures of them every day in the Israeli press, of course, which I read, but you'll see them also in the Western press, right? You will not see pictures of the Palestinians who are detainees in the Israeli prisons in the Western media. You just won't. The only exception, and this would go back years, is when you have, for example, a former Palestinian political leader, Barghouti is one of them, right? And you might see that. Otherwise, you don't see them. So the Israeli hostages, it becomes personalized, right? Whereas the Palestinians are just like this they're just like a dehumanized group. We don't know what they look like. We don't know who they are. We don't know whether they're women, whether they're children. A lot of them are women, by the way. We don't know anything about them. And that's why you get this imbalance, right? You get this imbalance in the way that international media portrays this, where they will talk about the Israeli hostages, but they will talk very little about the Palestinian detainees. Now, Palestinian media, of course, will talk about the detainees.
Yes.
And Arab media will talk about the detainees, right?
Yeah.
So if you're on Al Jazeera Arabic, they'll talk a lot about them, or even Al Jazeera English.
English, yeah.
But Yeah, but no, in terms of an international question, you always have a priority which is put on the hostages held by Hamas in the discussions. That's just the way it's going to be.
Coming back to your previous comments, that Gulf does not have a unified policy.
Mm.
Saudi Arabia, I think 1 or 2 days back, openly admitted that Israel is committing a genocide. Mohammed bin Salman actually openly accepted it as the political position. Uh, why do you think what is the politics behind not accepting the word genocide? I know that if the term is actually accepted by U.S. government, British government, um, there are legal repercussions of it. But why are we all, not you and I, but why is everyone debating about whether this is a genocide or not? It actually is a genocide.
There is a historical context to this, which is, and I just have to be honest with you, that I think if you live in the West, the first time you hear the word genocide, you're going to think about the Holocaust, right? And that kind of sets the bar for if something is a genocide or not. And you might say that's unfair, but that's just the way it is, right? So about 20 years ago, when we had the situation in Darfur and Western Sudan, I remember that I can't remember if Colin Powell came out and called it a genocide, but I know that there were certain activists like George Clooney, the actor, who called it a genocide. And we had this type of debate. Is it really a genocide, right? And a lot of people were holding out against that because, well, no, it might be a mass killing, but it's not a genocide. And what I kept thinking is they're saying it's not on the scale of what happened with the Holocaust. That's what's happening, right? Now, of course, when you talk about genocide as it's applied to Palestinians or specifically Gazans, it has a real resonance here because you can understand that a lot of Israelis would just say, no, you can't call that a genocide. Genocide was for Jews. Genocide was what happened to Jews. It doesn't happen
Yeah.
to the fit, right? And of course, those people who tend to support the Israeli position would therefore say, no, you can't call that a genocide, right? I'll just say something point blank to you. I don't actually use the word genocide myself on the website EA WorldView or when I do interviews, but that's because it has become a politically loaded word.
Yeah.
People use it as a political term. I use the word mass killing, right? And that's just a decision, which is, I think you can make the argument, if I was really to drill down with you, that there are certain hard right Israeli politicians and activists who were really calling for the Palestinian people to be wiped out, right? And I'm thinking of Mr. Ben-Gvir, the internal security minister, Mr. Smotrich, the finance minister. But I wouldn't necessarily say that a lot of Israelis would agree with that position.
Yeah.
Even if they support the war in Gaza, I don't think they support necessarily the ethnic cleansing. So, that's it. But I want to take this again as an analyst. I always like to take your question and go a bit further here, right? Why would MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, why would he say this at this time? Because that's a pretty strong statement for the Saudis to come out with, right? It's pretty strong. Now, does that mean that the Saudis are going to come out and they're going to provide military assistance to Gaza or even significant humanitarian assistance to Gaza? No. The Saudis, for example, do not want to be part of an Arab peacekeeping force in Gaza, which has been an idea which has been floated, right? Most of the humanitarian aid, with respect, which is going in, isn't coming from the Saudis. It's coming from international organizations. It's coming, paradoxically, from European countries and even the U.S., right? It's coming from Turkey, right? That's going in there. Here is what Mohammed bin Salman's looking at. For years, the Trump administration and the Biden administration policy had been to try to get Arab countries to normalize with Israel, especially the Gulf, including the Gulf states, right? So Bahrain had established relations.
Yeah.
I think Kuwait had. I'll have to double check. The UAE, of course, has been moving towards that, and Morocco outside the Gulf. And behind all of this is the Saudis. That would be the big prize. If Saudi Arabia normalized with Israel, right? Inevitably, when Trump comes back into office, there's going to be this question of, is the Trump administration going to push for a grand deal where Israel normalizes relations with Saudi Arabia? Because it makes for a great photo opportunity. Trump will want to be in the middle of that, and they get a big triumph. Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian monarchy, I don't think can afford to normalize with Israel while the war in Gaza is going on.
Yeah.
They cannot. Their own population, I think, would be against it. So the Saudis don't want discussion of normalization on the table. They might discuss having closer links with the United States, closer military links, for example. They'll always discuss that. The Saudis will always discuss closer economic links with the Trump family because they're providing most of the money behind Trump's son-in-law's venture, Jared Kushner.
Yeah, coming to son-in-law. Trump has a Lebanese son-in-law.
Right. This is Boulos' son. This is Boulos' son, right?
Yeah. Masad Boubous. I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. There is a certain kind of regime change that might, though there's no regime, there's no government, there's a caretaker government in Lebanon. Having said that, we have audience members from Lebanon who are awaiting your podcast, and it will help them to alienate the sound of drones that they're continuously hearing. So the question is that the Lebanese son-in-law and his father, what would the role they play? Would they want any kind of government change in Lebanon? Would it have any impact on Syria then?
Look, I mean, and I would love to hear with those people who are coming into us from Lebanon. Let me say, first of all, what is happening there is just appalling, and it's been appalling for years. A country which has been on its knees economically, a country which culturally has tried to navigate for decades the aftermath of the Civil War. I used to work at American University Beirut, and I love Beirut, absolutely love Beirut. And just to see what's happened there is gut-wrenching. When you approach what the Americans are going to do on Lebanon, and I'm no fan of what the Biden administration has done, no fan of it. But I think you need to realize that when you talk about how the Biden administration approached this, you could read this in terms of the rules of the game. You know what the State Department is doing. You know what the American military is doing. When Trump goes in to do foreign policy, it's on a friends and family basis, right? It's not organized. It's not coherent. So let's look at who he has appointed so far, right? He has appointed as ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. Now, Mike Huckabee has no Middle Eastern expertise. He's the former governor of Arkansas. He's a former presidential candidate. He is an ardent conservative Christian, and he's pro-Zionist, right? So in terms of Mike Huckabee will represent Israel's interest. But the latest thing is a man named Stephen Witkoff, who's been named as envoy to the Middle East. Yeah. And I assume that includes Lebanon. Well, who is Stephen Witkoff? Stephen Witkoff is a real estate developer. He made his fortune off real estate. He has no diplomatic experience. He has no government experience. He has no expertise in the Middle East, but he's an ardent Zionist. All right. Now, will Boulos, and here I'm talking about father rather than son, would he be a Trump envoy for Lebanon, right? Would they work with Boulos? If you follow the friends and family thing, quite possibly he may be asked to do so. But think about what it means to be the envoy to Lebanon, where you have to not only deal with the question of an Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon and the airstrikes, you have to deal with a Lebanese community which is fractured between Shia, Sunni, and Christian, where you have Hezbollah supported by Iran. You have some of the Sunni groups supported by other states, including the Gulf states, right? Where you have the Christian groups trying to maintain their position inside the country that takes place. That's almost an impossible task for a diplomat who is of the highest ability, right? For someone who's a real estate developer to go in there, or for Boulos to go in there and say, okay, we're going to bring everybody together. We're going to get a grand deal together, like a new government or something. It's not going to happen. What's going to happen is Lebanon's going to be paralyzed.
Yeah.
It's been paralyzed. It's been largely paralyzed for the last few years. It's going to be paralyzed. What the Trump administration is hoping is it'll be paralyzed, but Hezbollah will be absolutely crippled, right? Now, what are the knock-on effects of that? You've got Syrians who fled the Assad regime because they didn't want to get killed in Syria, who are now returning to Syria because they're just like, okay, we'll take our chances with the Assad regime rather than take our chances in Lebanon, right? You have got those Syrians who remain in Lebanon who already were being threatened with a humanitarian crisis because of the cuts in aid, who now are going to be in a dire situation. And you've got the average Lebanese person who's going to be in a dire situation in terms of making ends meet, right? And who is going to be the supporter of the Lebanese in this case? The Saudis, the UAE. Who's going to come in and say we need to give support to Lebanese society at this point? It's not a hopeful situation.
Another thing which was circulated, which was that there has been death threats given to Assad. And Bashar Assad in Syria. And the next thing that is also happening, I guess, the Israeli president met Biden today or yesterday. The Israeli chief of staff is going to meet Donald Trump soon when he goes to a trip to Washington, D.C. When we're talking about who is going to care for Lebanon, Nadeem Shahadi perfectly rightly, he said that, Lebanon is a failed state, but it's not a failed society. The question then comes to that, is Israel trying to is the eventual Israeli plan to take over the entire territory of Lebanon and integrate it into Israel? No?
And I said with respect, now, I mean, you have certain Israelis who talk about the project of Greater Israel, which includes Judea and Samaria, right? And so, there are territories which they will claim, which are part of Lebanon, which are part of Syria, which are part of Palestine. But the specific claims which Israel have made, of course, has been not based on religious terms. It's been on how power politics has played out. And so, for example, the Golan Heights is simply because of the 67 war, right? They took the Golan Heights. They don't want to leave the Golan Heights. It's a buffer zone with Syria, which is why they say. There is the possibility of an occupation of southern Lebanon, at least a strip along the border, to push Hezbollah back. But I don't see that as annexing the territory. It's an occupation until they feel that Hezbollah is no longer, quote, a threat. Because remember, Netanyahu, for domestic reasons, needs to get those 60,000 Israelis back into their homes in northern Israel, right? That's a contentious issue. I'm not saying, I'm not making any position of, that should be the priority. I'm telling you, for Netanyahu, it's a position that he has to.
That reminds me of actually the recent address that Netanyahu did with the people of Iran yesterday or day before yesterday, and he was basically talking about that. Do you know that your Khamenei regime has invested or spent $2.3 billion in the attacks that were completely futile on my country, Israel? And my question at that point of time was that you have invested $60 billion in the entire war.
And a lot of that was paid for by other people. That's the key, right?
Yeah.
A lot of that was paid for by the U.S., right? So Netanyahu can get away with that rhetoric. Let's get back to Lebanon for just a minute.
Yeah.
What I again, remember as an analyst that my reading of this is that the attack on Hezbollah in part was driven not by a desire to occupy Lebanon. It was driven by a desire to divert from Gaza. It was because Netanyahu and Gallant were like this, right? They were clashing. And so where could you unify? Netanyahu goes into Lebanon, and all of a sudden, you don't have hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the streets.
And that was also for security reason. They were not allowed to.
Yeah, in part, but also because a lot of Israelis who were criticizing him over Gaza were quite happy to support an attack on Hezbollah, right? And the Israeli military had wanted this for years. They'd wanted this for years to decimate Hezbollah. So I think the goal from the Israeli military's point of view was to what we call decapitate Hezbollah, take out the leadership, right? And make it so they can't rebuild. I think Netanyahu's goal was to have a second front where the pressure was removed on him. Now, the question that I think you're asking is, okay, well, what happens next? Hezbollah has been crippled. Lebanon has all these economic and political problems. Okay, what's going to happen next? You know, is Israel going to occupy the country? I don't think Israel will occupy, because if it does, it's going to face an insurgency, and because it's going to have to it's either going to have to sit there and occupy a damaged country, or it's going to have to invest a lot of money into it. What do they want to do?
There's no dearth of money for Netanyahu. But the second, the point which why is the Litany River so important in all of this geopolitics?
Why the
Litany River?
No.
Why is it so important as geopolitical marker?
Well, it's just simply because it becomes the marker in terms of here's our side, here's that side, right? And you don't cross this in terms of causing problems. So for the, it was a way, Hezbollah would say, look, here's the border. Israel can't cross this into our territory, right? In southern Lebanon. Israel says, you can't cross this and threaten our people in northern Israel. And that was just like the dividing line. It has that same type of symbolic resonance that the Green Line does in Beirut between the different communities, right? The point here is that's an extremely porous line because of rockets and now drones. That line can be crossed and will continue to be crossed. But anyway, Syria, since we're going across the region, look, Syria is not one country. Syria is three countries. That's the starting point, right? Assad reigns over most of Syria, but he's got a country which is also an economic basket case where most of the money goes to Assad and his cronies. Then you've got northwest Syria, which is protected by the Turks. And you've got northeast Syria, which is Kurdistan, which is protected by the Americans. And unless Donald Trump removes the American troops, which he tried to do in the first term, right? That's what happens. And by the way, if you notice in recent days, the U.S. military, knowing that Trump has been elected, they've sent out another marker. They've been attacking the Iranian militias in northeast Syria. They've been hitting them on a daily basis, right?
So that makes me the question about Iran, like the Indian media was completely, I think 25 days back, it was completely the boomerang that Israel is going to attack the nuclear sites of Iran. Israel is going to attack the nuclear sites of Iran. And it became like a lot of pieces were written, a lot of, I keep telling my students that this is all propaganda. But anyway, do you think that Israel can ever attack the nuclear sites, or it has the technology to attack the nuclear sites of Iran?
Netanyahu wants to. Netanyahu wanted to attack. Netanyahu wanted to attack. He wanted to attack the nuclear sites back in 2011, 2012. But it was his own establishment. It was the military and the intelligence services said, no, don't do that. They said it in part because of the question about whether the operation was feasible, right? And then they said it in part because if you hit Iran's nuclear sites, then you could spark this wider regional war, right? But the point from Netanyahu is, I'm already in this regional war, right? We already are in Lebanon. We already are carrying out attacks in Syria. We already are facing the Houthis in Yemen. So from Netanyahu's point of view, why not expand it? So when he when the Israelis were considering their attacks last month on Iran, um, both sides did this through the press, right? So Netanyahu's office put it out there. Oh, we could hit the oil sites. We could hit the nuclear sites. And then the Americans, the Biden administration, put it out in the press, which is don't hit the oil sites. Don't hit the nuclear sites, right?
Yeah.
Which was, okay, you can hit some military sites. You can hit some Iranian military sites, but don't hit nukes, don't hit oil. And the Israeli military establishment was also, look, we're not going to hit nuclear sites. We're not going to hit oil sites. Here's a reason why they don't hit oil sites. If the Israelis hit Iran's oil sites, the retaliation is that Iran, and they don't have to do this directly, they can do it through Yemen, they hit Saudi oil sites.
Yeah.
They hit Saudi oil sites. They drive the price of oil up, completely destabilize the international market.
Yeah.
Saudis don't want that, which is why in the last few days, what did you see? You saw a Saudi defense delegation in Tehran.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. The Saudis don't want an escalation. So I think that's another factor, which is why you don't have the Israelis going in to hit the nuclear and the oil sites. And they've made their point. They've made their point, which is we can hit your military sites, because what they did in that attack a few weeks ago is they knocked out air defenses.
Yeah.
And of course, you knock out air defenses, because then that means the next time you can go in, there's no air defenses to shoot down your missiles when you actually take out the bigger military positions.
The position for Iran actually is very precarious in this situation. Iran also has the longest serving Jewish population in its country. That is also an important diaspora. But what is also essential is that do you think all these analysis that has been put out, that there was an Iranian entire espionage or game behind the so-called alleged assassination of Trump? Is it true?
Iran's Revolutionary Guards have run assassination operations for years overseas. And what they tend to do, however, and this makes it kind of hard to track, is it's not like their own soldiers go out to do the operations, right? What they do is they recruit private people to carry out and do the operations, right? So they this goes all the way back to in fact, it goes all the way back to the early years of the Islamic Republic, when they've gone after dissidents, they've gone after activists. In recent years, they've gone after Israelis who lived in Turkey, for example. They've gone after other Israeli businessmen in other countries. Can't remember exactly which ones at this point, right? They've carried out kidnappings of Iranian dissidents in Iraq and carried them back. They tried to assassinate a prominent Iranian dissident in New York named Masih Alinejad, who I know, right? So I know that threat. They've tried to attack journalists who operate in London for Iran International, which is the Saudi-funded operation. Yeah, this is what they do. So certainly when the Americans returned that indictment against those three individuals, it is plausible that that one of the operations was to assassinate Trump. Certainly they took it seriously enough where they returned the indictment. Now, whether in fact the Iranians thought this was an operation really where they want to assassinate Trump, or they were just doing this for a bit of destabilizing, right, to unsettle the Americans, that's part of Revolutionary Guard politics. But yeah, the thing about the U.S. Iran thing is people usually go off into a camp and say, U.S. good, Iran bad, or Iran good, U.S. bad. And what you have to realize is there's actors on both sides, who will carry out these types of operations. There are hardliners in the U.S. and there are hardliners in Iran. The problem with the Trump administration will be those hardliners will feed off of each other.
Yeah.
Because the Trump people will make threats against Iran. The Revolutionary Guards will use that to try to shut down Iranian society and shut down dissent. When the Revolutionary Guards look to be tougher, then the Trump people will say, we can't talk to Iran. We can't appease the Ayatollahs. and they'll shut down American society in terms of any type of opening to try to bring the temperature down.
Talking about this kind of subtle nuances that go beyond the real picture, what has been the role of Dahlan in the past few years? I know he was involved in curating the Abraham Accords.
And initially, so Mohammed Dahlan, who longtime Palestinian politician to be official, and the role that for years that was there for Dahlan is he was going to be the alternative to Hamas in Gaza. That was the role, right? Is that you could push Hamas to the side and that Dahlan could go in there and he would provide this type of government. The problem is that while Dahlan has very good ties with certain Gulf states,
yeah,
and while he's supported by certain Americans, individuals in the United States, is where's your movement? Right? Mohammed Dahlan is basically Mohammed Dahlan. It's not like Hamas, which is a political organization. It's not even like Fatah, right? So I've always been skeptical about the idea that you bring Dahlan in to be like even a caretaker leader of an area, because governance has to be much more than that. So what has happened in recent years is it shifted from that idea of Dahlan being like someone who could be whatever you call it, prime minister of Gaza, president of Gaza, whatever.
Or just
and it's been more just a fixer. And again, the real vacuum here is that you have no good options for Gaza because Hamas itself, even before starting this cycle of violence, a lot of people in Gaza felt that Hamas was simply benefiting itself. It wasn't representing the people, that it wasn't at the same time getting any type of breakthrough to ease the blockade on Gaza. Some people saw Hamas with justification as being Netanyahu's favorite option.
Yeah.
Because Netanyahu, the Palestinian Authority is, let's put it this way, economically compromised.
Yeah.
They have their own issues. They don't have a vast amount of support in the West Bank.
Yeah.
The Israelis have effectively helped cripple Palestinian civil society by throwing people in prison, and Hamas and Fatah have crippled Palestinian civil society by throwing people in prison, right? So you don't have like a movement of Palestinian activists that can go into Gaza to help try rebuild the country. And of course, the civilians are in no position right now. They're running for their lives.
Yeah, and so they do not have the right to return even to the northern Gaza, which is completely bombarded. And that's so much of, bloodshed on a daily consumption level, the youngest victim being a 1-year-old, the oldest being a 97-year-old woman, and the entire implications on UNRWA and the funding of UNRWA.
We've got a question here, which I think plays off of this, right? Which is it pronounced Anurag?
Anurag Kant.
Yeah, Anurag, thank you. So I'm reading the question that, yes, Reza Pahlavi. He's back.
He's back.
Okay, he's back. So this is Iran. One of the biggest challenges for me is, as a longtime, I've got friends who I'm very close to in Iran who want reform in Iran. They have gone to great risk to try to get to reform in Iran. I used to work in Iran. I'll say that. And then the website I run, EA WorldView, covers Iran very closely, especially on human rights issues. All these people inside Iran who are really good people who just want political space. They want economic space. They want cultural space. And then they face numerous challenges. Some of these challenges are from the Iranian leadership, the regime. And some of these challenges are from the Iranian diaspora, who say, we'll go in and we'll overthrow the regime and then everything will be great for Iranians. And every time they say this, we'll go in and overthrow the regime, the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij militia, other Iranian agencies crack down on Iranian society. Because if there's a protest, as there was with the Women Life Freedom movement after the killing of Mahsa Amini, they say, oh, it's the US that's behind it. Okay. That's why I'm not a big fan of Reza Pahlavi.
I'm not a big fan of him because I don't know suddenly why this side character has suddenly marked an advent when the entire family was a stooge of the Americans for such a long time and the colonial, leaders. The timing doesn't make sense.
What you have is that you have an Iranian community in America as one country. You also have an Iranian community in France, for example, that's quite active, Iranian community in Canada. But you have these Iranian communities who, for 40 years, have been like, we'll overthrow the regime, and they aren't necessarily monarchist. They could actually be, quote, liberals, or they could actually believe in a secular government. But what happens here is that various politicians latch on to this, right?
Yeah.
And those politicians include Reza Pahlavi, because if the regime was overthrown, he would go back to Iran, where his father had ruled. He would want to try to be a political figure of influence, even if he didn't want to go back on the throne. He would be a politician.
He was in Israel last year. He went to Israel last year, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because the fact is that these networks are operated as the Iranian diaspora communicates with Israeli groups, with other Jewish groups, with the Americans as well. I'm not building up a conspiracy here. This is the way that politics works. So what happens is Reza Pahlavi is effectively telling the U.S. government, and he'll be telling the Trump people this, and he'll tell the Israelis this: you support me, and I'll look after you. I'll look after American interest and Israeli interest if I go back into the country, right?
I agree. Most of the Iranians who left, I think, during 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq war, the 8-year war, something which I say about Indians is that no one is as Indian as the Indian who doesn't live in India. In the same way, I think I'm not against this entire empowering aspiration that they have, which is about freedom, dignity, and respect for all. I'm not against that, but I also see that how Jared Kushner is feeding into that real estate development paradigm. That it's completely it then feels like, are they supporting Trump? Are they liberals? Are they out of touch with the current socioeconomic context of what is actually happening in Iran? And what disturbs me specifically is that when all these discussions are made, the entire mass killings, as you say, is avoided. The debate on that is avoided at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any movement for reform or even revolution, although I think, and I'm speaking about my Iranian friends, my Iranian contacts, they don't want revolution, they want reform. Sorry, has to come from within.
Yeah.
If you try to impose reform or revolution from outside, you poison the well. And all you have to do is think back to the case of Iraq in 2003 or Afghanistan, in which when you come in from outside and say, we're going to bring this type of government to you, we're going to bring this type of people in who will govern you, you will immediately lose legitimacy. What the Americans did is they worked with a lot of, frankly, grifters, people like Ahmed Chalabi, and they promoted them to take over. The Iraqis you should have supported are the Iraqis who are inside the country, who are trying to get civil space. And the way that the Americans went in 2003 got a lot of those good Iraqis killed. If you go into Iran, whether you're saying you could bring in and overthrow the regime through military action, through covert action, through economic action, you will get a lot of Iranians killed.
Yes.
You will get them killed. And so what you do is, when they come out on the streets for Women Life Freedom, you make sure they are seen. You make sure their cause is seen. If they are killed by, and a lot of them were killed by the Iranian security services, you make sure people know that. You make sure that that movement inside the country has your support, but you do not try to take it over.
Yeah. And the most interesting thing is about Mesa Amini also, like her Kurdish name was Gina Amini. And when the entire, symbolism of Mesa Amini, like there was this entire, during her death anniversary, a mural in Israel that was being, stated because a lot of Kurds are there in Israel. Uh, but one thing which also has to be explained, that America has had a very I love you not kind of relationship with Kurds. They use them, they abandon them. They use them, they abandon them. It's not like they're going to suddenly, if they come into the power, they are going to empower the Kurds, because then it means they're tackling Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey.
And that is where we are in terms of that. The reason why the Syrian Kurdish movement survives and has authority with it is that Assad is so weak, right? And so the Americans, the Americans at this point can support that Kurdish group to hold part of Syria because Assad is not a threat. Assad isn't powerful enough to overthrow him, and also because it's a buffer against Iran. Let's be honest about it. The American military are in northeast Syria because it helps check Iranian influence. Um, you know, let's hope it leads to Kurdish autonomy and a functioning Kurdish state, because there are issues within that Kurdish state. But that's the way
Yeah.
power politics works. We've got another really interesting question up here
Yes.
about transactional politics.
By Gorang.
Uh, Gaurang, that is such a great question, because my starting point when I've talked to people about Trump's foreign policy over the course of the last week, indeed goes all the way back when he was president, is that he operates on the basis of transactional politics. That's what's good for Donald Trump. But what's interesting here is, can you apply that to other leaders as well when they deal with Trump, right? And I think you could say that, but I think it operates in a different way. So let me give you a couple of examples, which I think are interesting. The first here is Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. If you think about back to 2017, what Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do is to make sure that he establishes himself as the effective day-to-day leader of Saudi Arabia. I mean, King Salman's on the throne, we know that, but because of health issues and the way that the system works, Salman's not really the day-to-day leader. So you may remember that Mohammed bin Salman had made his power play against
Yeah.
the other princes.
Yeah.
You may remember, however, that he had a serious problem with Yemen, because Yemen was his. He's the one that was behind the intervention in Yemen, right? So what's he going to do to protect his personal brand as well as Saudi interest? What the Saudis did, what MBS did immediately, is they flattered Trump. They brought Trump over to Saudi Arabia in 2017. They put some gold around his neck. And then remember that picture, that weird picture that looked like it was from The Lord of the Rings, if anybody reads it, which was the shining orb
Yeah.
with King Salman and General al-Sisi, right? And that was the Saudis engineering a photo opportunity to play to Trump's ego. Now, as Mohammed bin Salman is trying to set up power, and of course, what happens is this becomes like that old French phrase, the state, it is me. L'État, c'est moi, right? So what's good for the Saudi system is what's good for MBS. When you get to the point where he kills Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, because for some reason he sees Khashoggi as a threat, that is then transactional politics, that he plays with the Americans, with the Trump administration, to say, look, don't come after us over this. Don't let Congress come after us over this. That transactional politics, a lot of it is financial. So I'll just go back to the story which we referred to implicitly earlier. In 2022, Jared Kushner started an investment company. It has $2 billion behind it. Most of that money is from Saudi Arabia. Some is from the UAE. As of today, that investment firm has not returned a profit. Most investment firms return a profit by 2 years into a 4-year cycle. If Kushner cannot turn a profit with this investment company, who do you think he's beholden to? Who's the person who keeps him financially afloat? That would be the Saudis. The Saudis, MBS personally, and the Saudi leadership have got a transactional relationship with the Trump family. So do the UAE, because the UAE actually got in tight with some of Trump's advisors in 2017, one of whom wound up getting convicted on financial charges, a guy named Thomas Barrett. So there are all types of financial ties, because remember also, every time, and this will happen again, what happens is that foreign delegations, when they go to stay in Washington, guess whose hotel they go to? They go to Trump's hotel, because guess who makes money off of that? Donald Trump.
That is what my peaceful reform process is that Iran should offer Trump to make Trump towers in Iran.
Yeah.
And
Trump towers in
everything, because every Tehran, Isfahan, everywhere, in the sky, underground, everywhere. And then it's all solved completely.
Well, there's an interesting parallel here. It takes us away from the Middle East briefly. If you remember, Trump was ready to go to war with North Korea.
Yeah.
Fire and fury, little rocket man. What did it take to stop it? North Korea said, "Oh, let's talk." And they sent an invitation to Trump to come to North Korea in a giant envelope. I mean, it was massive. It was like 2 foot by 3 foot.
Yeah.
And they sent the deputy leader of North Korea across with the giant envelope. They posed for a photograph with a giant envelope, and Trump is beaming. And all of a sudden, Kim becomes he's a great leader. North Korea, Kim, he's a great leader. He's doing great things for his people. So if the supreme leader would just simply send a giant envelope to Trump, right, would be okay. But that ain't going to happen, because North Korea had enough flexible politics in terms of its ideology that it could do that. The Iran leadership does not have enough flexibility in its ideology. Its ideology of anti-Americanism is too entrenched for them to open up the offer to Trump. If they did, I think he'd accept it, because in the first term, he actually said at one point, "I'm going to meet Iran's president." It never came off. It was going to happen at the UN.
Let's see what happens, with Raisi gone Pezeshkian here. Things might change.
We live in hope. We live in hope.
I'm still, if anyone wants it, I'm still like, give him Trump towers. Give him Trump towers everywhere. And then it's like, solved. But coming to, we don't have much time now. The last question that I have, sir, is that sometimes I feel that, or sometimes I believe that the repercussions of Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, the so-called axis of resistance being, decimated, is that some other kind of militant organization would be formed. But that brings me to the thought that ISIS never really attacked Israel, only once in 2017, then they apologized. Why did ISIS never attack Israel? Never.
Because ISIS, as ideological as they are, ISIS also have power politicians that are in play. So here's where you go. Where does ISIS want to expand the caliphate? You might remember that most of their caliphate was in the northeast and north of Syria. But they also had positions in southwest Syria, not that far from Israel. If ISIS attacked Israel, Israel would have come into southwest Syria and absolutely leveled them, right?
What if they're working together? You never know.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it's not that you work together. You make calculations in terms of who you go after and who you don't go after, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, for example, the Iranians really didn't want to attack Israel this spring. The Iranians didn't want to fire the missiles. They're in a defensive position. But at the end of the day, the Israelis drove to it. Or
Yeah.
the Israelis, they assassinated so many Iranian commanders. The Iranians had to make a response. So one more question, I guess.
Yeah.
The petrodollar agreement. That's a really interesting question. I think you will probably see oil politics in that what the Saudis want is not only the renewal of the agreement, the Saudis want to be able to set the terms of the global oil market, right? Now, the global oil market faces a series of challenges right now. You have the issue of tensions with Iran, right? You have the issues of Russia's invasion of Ukraine with its knock on effects on Russian oil. The Saudis do not want OPEC to be destabilized in terms of being able to set output and to set the global oil price. They will work with the Americans, who, of course, are also a major oil producer, to make sure that happens. One of the things that immediately happens is that Trump says, drill, baby, drill. We're going to increase American oil production. We're going to increase fracking and so on. The Saudis will not want too much American oil to come on the market to lower the oil price. And you'll see maneuvers with the Trump folks to massage the oil market. So it is the petrodollar agreement, but it's also much bigger than that as well.
And the interesting thing is that initially, the oil, for example, in Libya, oil was free for everyone.
Yeah.
In Saudi, it is 2.3 riyals, which is almost like 44, 45 rupees. In India, the cost of oil is 89 or 90 rupees, 1 liter. Just half of it is in Saudi, and the Saudi citizens have to pay for oil. And that talks about, how this kind of internal domestic nuances of they have to pay the electricity bills, they have to pay the water bills, water is more expensive. Water is like half liter of water is 8 riyals.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
In my recent trip, I was like, I'll go thirsty for the entire day. I'll not spend 8 riyals on water. But the point is that the things are changing very, very quickly, and at the same time not changing at all.
In other words, what has been interesting is that in so many ways, Trump is destabilizing to the rules of the game, right?
Yeah.
But in other ways, other actors still play by the rules which they have set. Quite often we look at, and I understand why, we look at international politics and we go, oh, it's all America. It's all America. We start with America and so on. There are other actors in the game.
Yeah.
We haven't even touched upon India and what India is going to be doing.
Yeah,
and Russia,
Turkey,
right?
And China.
And Turkey and China. And each of those is going to have their rules as they see it. But by the way, India's rule, Modi and the BJP's rule will be flatter Trump, invite him to India, give him another like big present or something, and everybody will come out because Indians are very polite and they'll applaud Trump and he'll like India, and maybe he won't slap tariffs on India. That'll be the play that takes place.
I hope so.
But in a way, it leads to a bizarre kind of stability because the more countries that flatter Trump, the less chance he'll slap tariffs on them. And right now, there is a serious threat to the global economy if Trump puts on a blanket 15 to 20% tariff on everybody.
Yeah, 100% in Mexico, 60% in China, 20% in 20%. The entire economic policy that he has, which no one understands, is through tariffs.
Yeah, and which takes me all the way back to where we started, which is what's the one major appointment that has not been announced yet that we should be paying close attention to, and that's the Treasury Secretary. Is it going to be someone who has a great deal of expertise in terms of these economic matters? That would be someone like Jay Clayton, who was head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or is it going to be one of Trump's buddies from New York? And that will be Howard Lutnick, who is an investment banker, who I don't think would be so good. So there you go.
I'm following him on Truth Social.
Lutnick?
All of them. They are the topmost suggestions that I get on Truth Social. So I'm following everyone, the entire conservative brigade on Truth Social.
Are they nice? Are they nice people?
Yeah, 85 million. He has, Trump himself has 85 million followers. And I don't know when Truth Social was started.
It started after he got thrown off Twitter.
Yeah. So
it's about 2020 when he got thrown off.
Yeah. So
yeah. So
4 years, 85 million. Good enough. Can be organic. Yeah. So with this, sir, I would like to really thank you for the privilege of your time.